Hello again. So we're continuing on our discussion of Wallace Stevens's essay, The Figure of the Youth as Virile Poet. And we're beginning here with section 4 today. Now, up to this point, Stevens has been talking about the contrast between poetry and philosophy, and he's already argued that perhaps the advantage lies on the side of poetry. And this naturally raises the question, what is it about poetry? What special features about poetry or of poetry allow it to have this advantage over philosophy? Now, we saw before he characterizes philosophy as the official view of truth and poetry as the unofficial view. But that in itself doesn't really explain why it is that poetry should have an advantage over philosophy. Rather, the claim seems to be that philosophy fails in its own terms according to its own standards. And those are the standards of reason. So reason is not able to give us what it promises us, namely a kind of final and decisive view of the nature of reality or being. But poetry is able to provide us with this, or at least it's able to provide us with something called truth. Now, in these next sections, Stevens is going to qualify this because the truth that poetry provides us isn't exactly what we probably are thinking of when we think of philosophical truth. We're not dealing here with something that is verifiable, that can be justified and established by rational argument, but rather something that is lived through. And here we begin to see the importance of the title of this essay, The Figure of the Youth. What is it to know the truth of what it is to be young? The truth of youth. That's an unintentional rhyme. The truth of being young. What is it to experience this truth? It's not to perform a scientific experiment and to know it theoretically. Not fundamentally, at least, or not in its sort of richest embodiment. The truth of being young, the truth of youth, is something that has to be lived through. And then one can know truly what it is to be young. It's a kind of vital form of truth, a form of truth that doesn't exist just in the head, but that exists in every fiber of our bodies, every one of our faculties, our senses, our imagination, our pleasure and pain, as well as in our consciousness or intellect. And so it's this sense of a more well-rounded or holistic kind of truth that Stevens is getting at, I think, when he talks about the figure of the youth, or the youth as being the figure of the poet. The poet is someone who lives truth throughout their entire being, throughout their entire body, through all of their faculties, through all of their powers. Now, he also includes this notion of virility, being virile in this sense. And if you're not familiar with this term, maybe you looked it up. To be virile is not something that people are automatically proud of anymore these days, because it involves a certain idea of masculine prowess, especially masculine sexual prowess, masculine health. It's a term that, in this sense, of course, very naturally is associated with forms of male chauvinism and so forth. And so nowadays, in our sensitive era, to the idea of equality between the sexes, virility isn't something that tends to be celebrated in the way that it was in previous ages. But Stevens is not writing in our age; he's writing in the middle of the 20th century. Excuse me. And so he is not as shy about using this idea. And to make matters even more controversial or potentially controversial or grating to our ears, he characterizes this idea of the poet with another concept that may not have been familiar to you, or word rather, that may not have been familiar to you, and corresponding concept, namely the hieratic. The hieratic concept of poetry or philosophy. This is a term that refers to priestliness, the qualities of the priest of whatever religion. And so whatever qualities we think of when we think of the priest, they typically, or at least stereotypically, are not the same sort of qualities that we associate with virility. So there's this opposition between the virile poet and the hieratic sort of pseudo-poet, if it's a poet, or those hieratic occupations and professions, such as philosopher, that he wants to distinguish himself from. So the striving of the poet is a striving for a kind of transformation of the experience of reality in a way that highlights or accents this virility. So a kind of exhilaration, a kind of exaltation of life. Another fancy term that he uses that's associated with this is the notion of apotheosis, which is a kind of deification, an exaltation, an elevation to the highest level. The elevation of life to the highest level. That's poetic truth. So it's not merely an imagination of some transcendent reality that could exist, in a purely hieratic fashion as the positing of a kind of priestly dogma or something like that. It's not something that you have to have faith in or believe in that sense. Rather, it's something that you feel in your very, your muscles, your sinews, in your extremities, and it energizes you. That seems to be the kind of contrast he wants to make. And so the philosopher operates more in the hieratic dimension, more in the dimension of the priestly, which is something for him that obviously is associated with a kind of purely contemplative or a view of the imagination that is very sort of hollowed out and disconnected from experience and reality. Whereas the kind of imagination, it now becomes clearer in his account, that the kind of imagination that he is focused on as being integral to poetry is a kind of poetry that is not disconnected from reality. There's not a fundamental opposition between imagination and reality for Stevens. We can't emphasize that enough. So I'll say it again. Imagination and reality go together in Stevens. Imagination is a means to reality. It's not something that takes us away from reality. It doesn't represent a flight from reality into some kind of fantasy world. So this is something that he's going to be building on in these final sections, this notion of imagination. All right. Now, so page 47 at the bottom, we have the beginning of section 4. He says here to start, an attempt has been made to equate poetry with philosophy, and to do this with an indication of the possibility that an advantage in the long run may lie with poetry. And yet it has been said that poetry is personal. Okay, so that's where we ended up last time, with the idea that the center of poetry is in the process of the personality of the poet. And I raised the point last time that this might seem to contradict one of the features of modernism, as I laid it out at the beginning of the last discussion, which was the striving for a kind of objectivity as opposed to personality. But here Stevens makes clear that the kind of personality he has in mind is not the kind of personality that modernism is typically opposed to. He says, if it is personal in a pejorative sense, its value is slight. And he's referring to poetry here, remember, it is not the equal of philosophy. So if poetry is personal in the sense he calls the pejorative sense, then it isn't of much worth and it's not the equal of philosophy. What's the pejorative sense of personal? You might think about this. What are the ways in which we use this term or this terminology of that's just personal, right? Or something is personal. One way often associates it, I think, with what we describe as just subjective. You have a personal preference for sausage on your pizza as opposed to pepperoni. Right? That person personally prefers to have pineapple on their pizza, but that person over here personally thinks that's disgusting. It's not something that rises to the level of reality. It's something that merely exists in your own idiosyncratic makeup. So the personality of the poet in the sense that Stevens is talking about is not going to be this pejorative sense of personal, the sense in which we call something personal when we want to diminish it or marginalize it and say this isn't really something that's really fully real. It's just something that's sort of secondary to what's fully real, so or valid or objective. And so the sense of personality that he's going to be focusing on here is a sense in which the personality of the poet is something like, and this is my terminology, not his, but I think it's a fair reflection of what he's getting at. The personality of the poet is, in my terminology, a kind of reality detector. A reality detector, an instrument, in the way that, say, the thermometer detects the temperature. It's a kind of instrument that detects what's actually the case. Now, not everything about what's actually the case, but it does put us in connection with reality. Some dimension of reality, namely its poetic truth, as he will go on to say. So that gives you a sense of the contrast between two different kinds of personality that he's going to be focusing on here, or rather distinguishing in order to focus on the more important aspect of personality. Okay, now at the same time, Stevens is very deflationary in the concept of personality. So he doesn't want to say that the personality of the person is not their accidental idiosyncratic features, but it's something like their immortal soul or something like that, right? Or it's their transcendent mind, the kind of language, that you might expect in someone, say, like Shelley or Emerson from our discussion of the romantic theory of poetry. What he says, it's very deflationary. What is this personality? Well, it's connected, he says, to the incidence of the nervous sensitiveness. The nerves of the person, the nerves. Now, typically we don't think of virility, if we think of it at all, as being connected with the nerves, right? In fact, if we think of nerves, we tend to think of it, if we're not thinking of it in just a purely physiological sense, we're thinking of it in terms of perhaps nervousness, someone who wouldn't be considered virile because not courageous, right? Not manly in that traditional sense of person who isn't nervous but is confident, right? That's virility. So what does he mean by nerves here? Well, he's not talking about nervousness at all. That would be, very incompatible with what he ultimately wants to say about the poet. The nerves, rather, he's talking about here, maybe is reflected in certain colloquial phrases or idiomatic phrases we still use. Like, for example, you might say, I don't want to say, this is just an example. Like you might say about someone, I don't want to say that John or whoever is a bad guy, but, he just gets on my nerves. What are we saying there? We're saying it's just a kind of personality conflict, right? It's just given the kind of personality I am. For example, maybe I tend to be a very reserved, sort of introverted type of person, and John, he's the type of person who always wants to drag you off to do something, and he's always loud and boisterous and very extroverted, and that gets on my nerves. But not because there's anything wrong with that, right? There's anything intrinsically wrong with being extroverted. It's just that because of the kind of personality I have, he gets on my nerves. That kind of thing. So nerves in this sense is then connected to the personality of the poet, the particular nervous constitution. It's a more of an old 19th century way of speaking than the way we speak now. But that's what Stevens is getting at, this idea that there's a kind of constitution of the person that's just rooted in their bodily makeup, right? Nowadays, we would probably say something like, that's just how I'm wired. That's how I'm wired. I don't know why I keep saying James. I'm thinking of William James here. There's another example from William James coming up here. But Stevens is thinking of something as something that's like the idea of how you're wired. Even though he's writing, of course, in an era when computing is, or the idea of a computer is something that is unknown or more or less science fiction, very exotic. So he talks about nerves rather than, the way we're wired. But I think that sort of captures the idea that he's getting at. I think part of the reason I have William James on my mind is that I think there's an influence here of William James on Stevens, because James was someone who really wanted to understand the human mind as a part of nature in a naturalistic sense. It is governed by naturalistic mechanism. So in this sense, there's no need to sort of transport the human personality into some kind of transcendent realm or to consider it as something mysterious. And you can clearly see that reflected in Wallace Stevens' idea that basically the personality rests in the person's nerves. Okay, now he goes on then in this section, we're still on section 4, he talks about this idea that there's a kind of, you might establish, you describe it as a kind of correspondence. He describes it as a vocation. Speaking of hieratic, we have the idea of a vocation, sometimes associated in a sense with the priestly vocation, but what's the vocation of the poet? How do we understand the poet as having a vocation? And what he seems to have in mind here is something like this idea that there are certain forms. There's an order of forms that corresponds to an order of minds. That is to say, my mind is ordered in a certain way such that I am called, or I have a vocation. Vocation means calling, right? I'm called to towards the construction or the reception of certain forms. That the particular poet has a particular way of forming, of bringing into being forms. And on the side of the audience or the reader, in the case of poetry, you might say that similarly there's a kind of calling, right? That we as readers are called to, or have a vocation to read certain poems. That is to say, there are some things, I think in a colloquial sense, we could say that we relate to, right? I can relate to this, I can't relate to that. I can't relate to this kind of poetry, I can't relate to this kind of poetry. Or maybe, for some of you, you can't relate to poetry at all, and you're regretting signing up for this course. But hopefully that's not the case. But we say things like that, right? I can relate to this, I can't relate to that. That gives a more common sense or ordinary way of thinking about what I think he's getting at here when he talks about the vocation of the poet to a particular form. On page 49, towards the top, he says, here I'm going to quote a bit of it. He says, the way a poet feels when he is writing, or after he has written, a poem that completely accomplishes his purpose is evidence of the personal nature of his activity. The way a poet feels when he is writing or after he has written a poem that completely accomplishes his purpose is evidence of the personal nature of his activity. So how? How does a feeling provide evidence of the personal nature of the activity of writing poetry? Continuing on, he says, to describe it by exaggerating it, he shares the transformation, not to say apotheosis accomplished by the poem. So this goes back to this idea of there being an order of minds and an order of forms. So in a basic sense, on the side of forms, this seems to allude to an ancient notion of poetry as forming. The poet is giving form, giving shape. Giving shape, for example, to our experience, giving shape to our perception, giving shape even to life, giving shape to our surroundings. That's what the poetry is giving form. And that corresponds to a certain order of the mind of the poet. And so if in this ordering of forms, one of the things that's happening is there's a kind of transformation or an apotheosis, right, in this sense, a raising up to a higher level, an elevation of our surrounding environment, of an elevation of life, then the poet is going to experience that elevation in an isomorphic or symmetrical way as well. And that sort of symmetry here is a kind of evidence, he says, for the personal character of poetry. He goes on to say, it must be this experience that makes him think of poetry as possibly a phase of metaphysics. This experience makes him think that maybe poetry is a phase of metaphysics. In other words, he feels like he's transcending. It could even be, like such a feeling of exaltation that's an out-of-body experience. I've seen this thing and I've captured it in this poem, and I've given shape to my world. I've given order and intelligibility to my life in what I've written here, and that just, it gives me such a great feeling of exaltation and apotheosis that there must be a spiritual realm. There must be some transcendent realm. So that he regards this as a kind of psychological explanation. And clearly it's got a kind of debunking character to it. We don't need to really believe that there is this, remember the vital node that he talked about, the point of nexus, the center from which all poetry flows. We don't, from Stevenson's perspective, we don't really need to believe in that, but it's understandable why a poet would think that there might be such a transcendent source of poetry because of this feeling of apotheosis that the poet experiences, which is also described as a feeling of apotheosis, a state of elevation, a feeling of liberation. What is this feeling? Where does it come from? Does it come from, from God? Does it come from some higher transcendent reality? On page 51, Stevens says that the identity of the feeling is subject to discussion, and from this it follows that its value is debatable. There's no answer to these questions of where this comes from, and he's not going to be concerned to try to explain it, the origin of this feeling. But he just takes it as a fact that constitutes the authentic, we might say, poet. Okay. So what does any of this have to do with reality? Well, this brings us to the next section, section 5. Here he makes this interesting statement in the second paragraph of section 5, which occurs on page 53. He says, the incredible is not a part of poetic truth. The incredible is not a part of poetic truth. So there's this opposition that's going to be important for him between the incredible and the credible. And actually, the relationship between these could be maybe better represented by an arrow. Because he thinks this is the poetic function, is to transform the incredible into the credible. And this is a rather unusual way of describing the poetic function. So we're going to want to try to unpack this a little bit and make it a little bit clearer. So he says, the incredible is not a part of poetic truth. On the contrary, what concerns us in poetry, as in everything else, is the belief of credible people in credible things. There's a lot packed into that statement. Now, first of all, we might note here that many people would think that poetry, or more broadly literature or art, is at least very often concerned with the incredible. That's the whole point of it. Think about, we're awash in superhero movies and science fiction movies, right? In the realm of, and of course, those are originally rooted in the realm of fiction and poetry, epic poetry, being the original form of what, today we find more familiarly in movies and TV and so forth. It's natural for us to assume that, the whole realm of art is very much concerned with the presentation of the incredible. But that's not the kind of poetry that he's concerned with here. He says what concerns us in poetry. So he's not strictly speaking denying that there can't, that there can be a poetry of the incredible, a poetry of the fantastic. That's not what he's concerned to do here, but rather what he's saying that the poetry that concerns us. What's the poetry that concerns us? Well, remember the context of this discussion. The poetry that concerns us is the poetry that's in competition with philosophy, right? So the poetry that can pick up from philosophy's failure to satisfy according to its own standards and provide us with a kind of reconciliation to life, a kind of sense of overcoming the despair of truth that philosophy leads to in skepticism. That kind of poetry is the one that concerns us. And that, like everything else, at least like philosophy, is concerned with what credible people say about the credible. It's concerned with credibility. It's not concerned with incredible claims. It follows, he says, that poetic truth is the truth of credible things. Poetic truth is the truth of credible things. Not so much that it is actually so, as that it must be so. In other words, this is a normative demand. This is the way poetry ought to be, is what he's saying. He's laying this down as a sort of standard of what good poetry should be. It should be credible, and it should be of credible things. Now, how then does this involve a kind of drawing upon the incredible? In the next paragraph, well, actually the same paragraph, but it's farther down the page here. He says, our nature is sorry, it's a hard word to say. Our nature is an illimitable, that is, can't be limited, space through which the intelligence moves without coming to an end. The incredible is inexhaustible, but fortunately it is not always the same. We come in this way to understand that the moment of exaltation that the poet experiences when he writes a poem that completely accomplishes his purpose is a moment of victory over the incredible. So this is the incredible transformed to the credible is a victory over the incredible. A moment of purity that does not become any the less pure because, as what was incredible is eliminated, something newly credible takes its place. As what was incredible is eliminated, something newly credible takes its place. And I think here the best, that gives a hint of what he's getting at. And I think probably what he has in mind here is something like a situation in which the official view of being, the prevalent philosophy, the conventional philosophy of a time, which may be very coextensive with a particular religious structure of the time, or religious faith, religious belief, when that becomes incredible, right? When people can no longer believe that, there actually are gods on Mount Olympus. Or closer to our time, of course, we're familiar with Nietzsche's pronouncement of the death of God, the idea that the belief in the Christian God, or the God of morality, as he sometimes says, has become unbelievable. And so that's the kind of incredibility he seemed to have in mind here. The poet rescues the credible from a situation in which incredibility has become the norm. We might think it's better to say here, we're sort of a kind of incredulousness, a kind of lack of faith, a loss of faith, right? The poet restores a new faith, finds what's still believable and serves it up to the people. What can we still believe in our time? If we can no longer believe in the old gods, right? If we can no longer believe in the old worldview, it's up to the poet to show us what's still credible. And that means that the poet has to be this kind of reality detector, as I said earlier. The poet can't be indifferent to, what's real. Okay, so here's where poetic truth is going to come into play. All right. On the next page there, 54, towards the bottom of the page, he says, it may be said that poetic truth is an agreement with reality. Poetic truth is an agreement with reality brought about by the imagination of a man disposed to be strongly influenced by his imagination, which he believes for a time to be true. So this is a picture of the imagination, again, as a kind of truth detector. I imagine this world and I believe this world the way I imagine it to be true. So it's not some kind of imaginary world in the ordinary sense. Rather, I think we might connect this with the concept of interpretation. The poet has an interpretation of the world. It's a function of his imagination that helps to give the world a form, right, in the way we were describing it here. The poet's mind is forming the world, giving it a kind of structure and intelligibility that's credible, that dispels the incredibility that pre-existed this act of poetic imaginative construction. So the poetic truth is an agreement with reality brought about by the imagination of a man disposed to be strongly influenced by his imagination, which he believes for a time to be true, expressed in terms of his emotions, or, since it is less of a restriction to say so, in terms of his own personality. So there you have it, right? And he introduces the discussion in the next paragraph, then the figure of the youth as a virile poet, because the virility comes in here very much in connection to the sense of having sufficient self-confidence and sufficient force within one's own personality to resist pressures from other sides that are going to want to stifle you and bring you, as it were, back into line with the old incredible beliefs. And of course, here you're dealing with the conflict between the youth as the virile poet and especially the hieratic order, the priests of one kind or another, which of course may not be officially priests, institutionalized priests. They may be various forces of conventionality and of conformity. So he says the figure of the youth as virile poet is always surrounded by a cloud of double characters, against whose thought and speech it is imperative that he should remain on constant guard. These are the poetic philosophers and the philosophical poets. So the poet has to be concerned to distinguish himself from philosophers, especially those philosophers who pass themselves off as poets, because they're likely going to be, it turns out, the things that are going to hold him down or restrict his vital forces and energy and his vocation to provide a kind of victory over the incredible and serve up the credible to the people. There's a kind of immediacy to the character of the poet that comes through on page 56 when he says, the philosopher proves the philosopher exists. Think of Descartes' Meditations, right, where he says, I think, therefore I am. The philosopher proves that the philosopher exists. The poet merely enjoys existence. This seems to be an important aspect of the distinction between philosophical truth and poetic truth. Poetry doesn't argue. Poetry just demonstrates in a kind of direct, immediate way. It shows what's credible. You might say that credibility shines forth from valid poetry, as Stevens might put it, from real poetry. Or, as he says on page 50, essential poetry. But we might describe this as authentic poetry or valid poetry. The credibility of such poetry is self-evident. It doesn't need to be argued for. And so the virile poet should resist the temptation to provide an argument for his view of reality. Okay. So in section 6, he introduces this concept of the hieratic explicitly, and he says in opening section 6, I have compared poetry and philosophy. I have made a point of the degree to which poetry is personal, both in its origin and in its end, and I have spoken of the typical exhilaration that appears to be inseparable from genuine poetic activity. I have said that the general progress from the incredible to the credible was a progress in which poetry has participated. I have improvised a definition of poetic truth, and I have spoken of the integrity and peculiarity of the poetic character. Summed up, our position at the moment is that the poet must get rid of the hieratic in everything that concerns him, It must move constantly in the direction of the credible. He must create his unreal out of what is real. And that might be confusing because we've just been saying that poetry is supposed to be about reality. But of course, the unreal here, what he means is the imaginative construct. The imaginative construct cannot be purely imaginary. It must be constructed out of elements of the real. So it's a sort of selective interpretation of reality. That's what he's claiming here, and therefore its building blocks are reality. It's not something that the poet pulls out of his mind or his genius out of whole cloth. Is a pure fantasy, but rather it's constructed out of the building blocks that the poet is taking in out of his own experience of reality. Okay. And 59, he goes on to say that poetic truth is a factual truth. There's a long sentence here. I'm going to begin about halfway through it. He says, desiring with all the power of our desire not to write falsely, do we not begin to think of the possibility that poetry is only reality after all? So there's the claim. Poetry is only reality after all. And that poetic truth is a factual truth. Seen, it may be, by those whose range in the perception of fact, that is, whose sensibility is greater than our own. This points out something important, which is that for someone whose imagination is limited and whose sensitivity to what's real is limited, who maybe is living, kind of deluded life, not necessarily in the sense that they're actually mentally ill or insane, but that they're living just purely with a lot of conventional ideas in their head that they never really examined for themselves or thought of, and so they're just going through life, kind of sleepwalking through life, we might say, in a metaphorical sense. That such a person might read, essential or valid or authentic poetry, and it might seem to be completely incredible to them, or maybe even unintelligible to them, or at least just something that they can't relate to. But that by itself doesn't imply that the poet hasn't captured reality. The poet is going to be an avant-garde figure, right? The poet is going to be in advance, at the front of the train of culture as it moves forward. And so we should expect that those who are lacking in poetic power or imagination in the back of this train aren't necessarily going to be able to appreciate where the poet is taking them in front. And they're not going to be able to appreciate the elevated and elated states of the poet, the apotheosis of the poetic feeling of victory over the incredible that the poet experiences. Okay. Perhaps, he says on 61, the best definition of poetry, remember, he doesn't think that you can, strictly speaking, define poetry. And incidentally, here we might state explicitly, because I don't think we have yet, that it's pretty clear by this point that one of the reasons Stephen thinks that you can't really give a once and for all definition of poetry is that that in itself is contradictory to the nature of poetry, insofar as poetry is rooted in the personality of the poet. And it's the poet who's ultimately going to be the interpreter of what poetry is for any particular era. So you can't have a sort of eternal definition of poetry. But he says, one is often tempted to say, again, this is page 61, one is often tempted to say that the best definition of poetry is that poetry is the sum of its attributes. So here we may say that the best definition of true imagination is that it is the sum of our faculties. Poetry is the scholar's art. So again, we might remember from last time that he says that the true poet is someone who's going to unite reason and imagination. Imagination sort of takes the lead, but in a certain sense, imagination is drawing upon all of our faculties. Again, as I said earlier, our sensitiveness, our sensibility in that sense, our ability to feel pleasure and pain, our perceptual faculties, our intelligence, our reason, and our imagination. All of these things are going to be drawn together in poetry. So the scholar's art also is going to be part of poetry. Okay. How are we doing on time here? So we're getting towards the end. There's this, on page 64, there's this raising of a kind of objection, I think is maybe one way to look at it. This begins with a note from Klaus Mann's book on Gide, the André Gide, the French author. And the quote from Klaus Mann reads as follows. So this is me quoting Stevens, quoting Klaus Mann on page 64. The quote reads as follows. The main problem which Gide tries to solve, the crisis of our time, is the reconciliation of the inalienable rights of the individual to personal development and the necessity for the diminution of the misery of the masses. So, on the one hand, there's a legitimate right that the individual has to develop themselves, develop their talents, develop their personalities, fulfill themselves. On the other side, there's the fact that there's all this injustice and misery in the world. And the traditional vocation of the poet or the author or the writer that is being alluded to here is of someone who has a calling to contribute to both of these aspects. So the writer is someone who helps the personal development, the education of the individual, but also the writer is the person who serves a kind of prophetic role. Traditionally, someone who is calling for social change, is pointing out the injustices. You know, think about Charles Dickens' works, for example, is highlighting the conditions of poverty, misery, and injustice in the Victorian England of his time. That kind of idea. But the problem is that these things seem to be potentially incompatible. It's very easy for a poet or a writer to either become exclusively a kind of aesthete who's just concerned with sort of developing personal refinement and developing all the personal faculties, so the person is very cultivated, has a very extensive knowledge of things, has a very fine and refined aesthetic sensibility, and so on. But if they focus on that, then that seems to be just kind of ignoring in an unjust way the misery of the masses. On the other hand, you can go too far in the other direction too and become essentially just a kind of polemicist, or even at the extreme, a kind of propagandist for a particular political program, right? So, I mean, think about something like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin or something like that, which is to say, as that example illustrates, it's not necessarily that your political program is a bad one, the abolition of slavery in this case, but that it seems to draw away from this other function of art, of cultivation, what the Germans call Bildung, this idea that you're trying to build up your own character, your own personality in a way that realizes your humanity. One of the reasons that we call the humanities the humanities, because the study of these things makes you a well-rounded person, right? With kind of a banal way of putting it. Makes you a person who has a lot of character. So Stevens, at the end of his essay, in these last 3 pages, is partly dealing with this problem. How do you reconcile these two sides, the sort of the personal and the moral vocations of the writer? And he doesn't give any kind of easy answer here. Page 65, the beginning paragraph there, he says, the poet reflecting on his course, which is the same thing as a reflection by him and by us on the course of poetry, will decide to do as the imagination bids, because he has no choice if he is to remain a poet. Poetry is the imagination of life. There's another sort of quasi-definition. Poetry is the imagination of life. A poem is a particular of life thought of for so long that one's thought has become an inseparable part of it, or a particular of life so intensely felt that feeling has entered into it. So, partly he seems to be saying here, it's not as if the poet really has a choice as to what kind of poetry they're going to produce. They can either be a poet, a true, authentic, essential poet, which means they can produce valid poetry. And the way that they do that is they have to be true to their imagination. Remember at the end of section 3, last time we were talking about Cézanne. And Cézanne at one point, this is back on page 47, he says, to to his son, in the last quote, he says, one must succeed in feeling for oneself. One must succeed in feeling for oneself and in expressing oneself sufficiently. And he calls this the search for the soul and unique aim. The search for the soul and unique aim. In other words, the poet just, in a sense, is in a search for his imagination, his own imagination, his own personality. And he didn't choose that for himself, right? Go back to when we were talking about the concept of nerves. And we said someone gets on my nerves because I'm an introvert, I'm a reserved person, and they're outgoing and an extrovert. And so they get on my nerves. Well, I didn't choose to be reserved or an introvert, right? And they didn't choose to be outgoing or an extrovert. We didn't choose these characters. And similarly, the poet doesn't choose his personality. The poet can only be true to his personality or false to it. And so the vitality and the virility of the poet ultimately is going to be a function of them having a vital experience of life and not letting that vital experience of life be squelched by their environment and their surroundings. The poet and the poet's reality become part of the poet's vital experience of life, he says, even if the poet's not aware of it. That's back on page 65 again. So it's a kind of transference or translation of their own vital experience into their poetry that is what connects the poet to reality. And that's why this concept of virility is so important, and why the poet needs to resist the kind of hieratic pressure of the philosopher or the religious figures, because dogmas, doctrines, conventional ideas are going to, of course, very naturally be weights that pull down the vitality of the poet and perhaps potentially distort their own experience. So that's basically what the poet's task is, to be able to be true to their own personality and to dive deeply into the sole aim of the imaginative construction of their own vital experience of life. Okay, well, that gives us a sense of what's basically contained in this essay. It gives us some indications of Stevens's approach to poetry and its relationship to philosophy. Now, next we're going to be looking at what's regarded by many as Stevens' greatest work, or certainly one of them, the Notes Towards a Supreme Fiction, which is a poetic discussion of the nature of poetry. So it's a kind of a union of form and content, where the content, the nature of poetry, is expressed poetically itself. And so we're going to be able to look at both of these aspects of his understanding of poetry and how he expresses it, beginning next time.